As a noble samurai warrior, you walk the lands with your indomitable fighting spirit. Your enemies are shattered against your unbreakable resolve. But also, you have a wisdom and dignity that shines through in times of peace. The samurai is an often overlooked and underrated subclass for the fighter. But make no mistake, playing a samurai gives you access to a powerful subclass. So let me tell you why you should put all your biases aside and play a samurai. This guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions. I won't be going over basic subclass information because you can probably read. I've either played or DM'd for all the fighter subclasses, and my opinions almost certainly won't align with the D&D community at large. I will be ranking the subclass based on 5 criteria. I will be scrutinizing subclass features gotten at later levels more intensely, because most players aren't going to make it past 10th level with a character, so my analysis is weighted more towards earlier subclass features. With all that out of the way, let's begin. The first thing I need to note about the samurai is that it is an absolute buzzsaw of a subclass. If you've never seen a samurai work in combat, you're missing out. A samurai can deal so much more damage because it fundamentally shifts the action economy. Using its fighting spirit, the samurai can give itself advantage, and advantage means that you are more consistently damaging your opponents. But at later levels, you're just making more attacks. And through it all, the trusty, dependable samurai is doing more damage on its attacks just because it is more consistent than almost any other fighter subclass. Don't even get me started if you're running feats like Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter or multiclassing into something like a Rogue or a Paladin. Because combined with the Samurai subclass, your damage numbers can get astronomical. A pissed off, action surging, fighting spirit boosted Samurai is not to be messed with. That damage is no joke and can quickly turn your boss's health bar into a health puddle. But wait, because the samurai isn't a one-trick pony, it's also a defensive juggernaut. I know it doesn't seem like it, but Fighting Spirit is a powerful defensive ability as well. That extra few temporary hit points can be the difference between staying up or going down in combat. At 3rd level, you've effectively got an extra 15 hit points per long rest, which means if we're going on averages, you've got an extra 40% health. That is nothing to scoff at. And it's even better when you pop a fighting spirit once you get up from being downed. Healing words become all the more effective on a samurai because they can make up for the comparatively small amount of healing by giving themselves more temporary hit points. So a samurai that's using their fighting spirit effectively is much more tanky than you would imagine. Thus far though, I've only been discussing samurai inside of combat, but they're great outside of combat too. I'd actually say the samurai focuses on the game outside of combat. Bonus proficiency and elegant courier can make a samurai the face of the party. For many players, combat is not the majority of what you'll be doing in a D&D game. The samurai is one of the few fighter subclasses that really prioritizes out of combat abilities. And I have to say that elegant courtier is so good. It is such an underrated subclass feature. Wisdom is already one of the best ability scores in Dungeons & Dragons 5th editions, if not the best. Perhaps tied with dexterity. Elegant Courtier allows you to use your wisdom for persuasion checks, which is fantastic. Ideally, if you are a dignified, noble fighter, you'll be using persuasion often anyway, especially if you're the face of the party. And more importantly, in my opinion, you'll be given proficiency in wisdom saving throws. Wisdom saves are some of the most dangerous saves in all of D&D 5th edition. While dexterity and constitution saving throws are bad, yeah, they deal damage to you, wisdom saving throws fucks with your characters mentally. Being charmed or mind controlled usually comes from a wisdom save, or worse, the dreaded hold person. So I'm always a fan of pumping up wisdom saves as a martial, and you can certainly do this as a fighter because you have more ASIs to work with. Overall, I've seen people who haven't played or ran for a samurai before not really give this feature the time of day. I never expected it to be as good as it is. But every samurai I've ever ran for, new and veteran players have been able to use the heck out of this feature. Ideally, if you're a DM, you should probably lean into persuasion checks more for the samurai to really make it shine. But even if you don't, it's still a very impactful subclass ability. And also, the samurai is super competitive at high levels. Their later level subclass abilities are top tier. Rapid Strike and Strength Before Death are both incredibly powerful. Rapid Strike allows you to forego advantage on a target, and instead, you can make an additional attack roll as part of the same action. If your party uses flanking rules and you're often getting advantage on melee attacks, this is a straight up broken ability. And Strength Before Death allows you, when you fall to 0 hit points, to use your reaction and immediately take an extra turn. An extra turn is ridiculous in D&D 5th edition due to its reliance on the action economy. The more actions you have, the more attacks you have, the greater the advantage you have in combat. So a whole extra turn from an 18th level fighter, that could single-handedly change an entire combat, and I've seen Strength Before Death save high-level parties from TPKs. While you absolutely can multi-class a samurai, the later level features are so good, I'd not blink an eye at going 20 levels in this subclass. So you are a buzzsaw in combat with strong defensive abilities later on with great RP abilities thrown in. This is just an incredible subclass, but honestly it's held back by its concept. Of course, it's called the Samurai, and if you play this subclass, you're going to be called a weeb. Look, I don't make the rules, I'm just telling you what's gonna happen. Really though, being called a samurai kind of holds this subclass back because you're really just a noble warrior. Knights, Kingsguard, a Viking Huskarl, or Hussars could all be archetypes in this space. You're a ferocious and spirited warrior with the capacity to sway people. Calling this class samurai excludes so many other possible warriors throughout history, and so many other archetypes that you could use. This subclass could easily represent an Athenian philosopher who's fighting in the military. You've got this strong fighting spirit with the ability to sway people. Guess what? That description literally describes Socrates. If I was trying to build Socrates, I would pick the samurai subclass, which is weird. So I beg of you, don't get bogged down in this subclass being called a samurai, because at its heart, it is just a noble warrior. Go beyond the bounds that the designers have provided for you. If you're trying to play a noble warrior, my advice, look to the samurai. However, let's look at some potential multi-classes. The samurai is good on its own, but any martial class would love to get a few levels in samurai. Rogues, by far, get the best use out of fighting spirit. Instant advantage pairs so well with sneak attack. And if you're a rogue at range, sometimes you don't really need to use cunning action as a bonus action. Why not replace that with a fighting spirit bonus action? Or you could multi-class into Monk, which makes great use of your fighting spirit. A Monk is already a short rest warrior with key points. Second Wind and Action Surge pair nicely. Plus, Unarmed Fighting Style mixes well, and Fighting Spirit slotted in, giving advantage and temporary hit points with a monk class that already doesn't have enough hit points just works really nicely. And besides, a Kensei Monk Samurai Fighter multi-class just feels right. They mix very well, and I have to imagine it's intentional. Or you could do the bog standard Paladin multi-class, because it's going to be Smite City. With more advantage, you're going to be getting more crits. A Paladin subclass like the Oath of Redemption loves a multi-class dip into Samurai. However, I rate Paladins a little bit lower on my personal ranking of the multi-classes for a Samurai because the charisma requirement of a Paladin clashes with the wisdom requirement of a samurai. I understand that advantage on your smites looks really good, but even still, I don't think paladins make the best use out of samurai. The ranger class, though, does pair very well, because the wisdom of the ranger mixes with the wisdom of the samurai. Both are wisdom based, and since ranger has access to things like hunter's mark or favored foe, that goes great with fighting spirit. The more consistently you're hitting, the more damage you'll be doing. The ranger has lots of great utility spells, which mix with the samurai's tendency to focus on outside of combat. I think it's underrated how much synergy there is between the ranger class and the samurai subclass. But I would like to say that the samurai subclass is not perfect. It has two big weaknesses in my mind. The first is that 3 fighting spirits per long rest can feel a bit limiting. I don't think that's enough fighting spirit uses. Sometimes you're put into a tough situation between using fighting spirit early on or waiting until a boss fight at the end of an adventuring day. Tireless helps at 10th level, but it's really late to get that ability. Most D&D parties stop playing around 10th level. So there's always going to be this tension between wanting to use your fighting spirit and realizing I only have 3 per long rest. And also, some of the samurai's best abilities are the later ones, which for most players you'll never get to. But that's not the subclass's fault, it's just how the game is played. If most D&D parties went to 20th level, then I would look at the samurai much more highly than I do right now. But maybe 5 to 10% of samurai players are ever going to use Rapid Strike in a game. Even less are going to be able to use Strength Before Death. So the samurai is never going to be reaching the highest echelons of the fighter subclasses. But it is still a great fighter subclass, so let's start looking at the ratings. Like always, we got 5 categories: roleplay, offensive, defensive, utility, and X Factor, or how are you unique from all the other fighter subclasses? And more so, how powerful or interesting is that unique feature? On the role-playing aspect, it's an 18 out of 20. It would be a 20 out of 20 if this dumb subclass wasn't called samurai. It's got all the foundations for a really strong subclass identity, but for some reason the designers have locked it into one type of noble warrior, when that's super limiting. But I'm not going to detract too many points because it's just a name. And while it does lead a lot of players astray, but that doesn't mean you can't play a noble warrior derived from another historical place or time period. Samurai is just a name. But if we move to the offensive rating, this is an easy 18 out of 20. The action economy is king in D&D 5th edition. The samurai at level 3 fundamentally alters the action economy. Advantage and temporary hit points are powerful at earlier levels. And as you go later and later into this subclass, it just continues to break the action economy more and more. Again, the only reason why this isn't a 20 out of 20 is because many of its best offensive features are locked behind later levels, which most players will never get to. As for the defensive rating, this is a 15 out of 20. The extra scaling temporary hit points are always nice. Proficiency in the wisdom save is powerful, or proficiency in intelligence or charisma if you already have proficiency in the wisdom save. If Strength Before Death were a little bit earlier, this again would be 20 out of 20, but it's not, so 15 out of 20 for the defensive rating. It could also be a bit higher if you got more uses of your fighting spirit. As for utility, this is an easy 15 out of 20. Bonus proficiencies and a bonus to your persuasion checks really help to carve out a niche for the samurai out of combat. You are the face of the party and a noble warrior. I think if they were remaking this subclass though in 2020, perhaps they would add a little bit extra out of combat, but for a party without a designated face, or for a group that favors roleplay over combat, the samurai and its many features that help outside of combat are a welcome addition to any party. So 15 out of 20. As for the X Factor, I struggled with this one for a bit. Fighting Spirit all by itself is a great subclass feature. However, 3 uses, again, it's not a lot, especially if you're in a campaign that runs 3 to 4 combat encounters per day. I have to take into account that sometimes the samurai in combat might just feel like a regular vanilla fighter. Now, when the samurai is cooking and doing its thing, it's a buzzsaw. But that's with its fighting spirit up. So because of that, I'm only giving the samurai a 12 out of 20 for its X Factor. It could certainly be tuned just a little bit. But at the end, the samurai comes in with a very strong 79 out of 100. This is definitely in the top half of all fighter subclasses. Perhaps in the coming months or years, the designers at Wizards of the Coast will revisit the samurai. And if they do and they tweak just a few things, this could easily scale to be one of the best fighter subclasses out there. But maybe you're looking for a subclass with a bit more raw power. And if that's the case, check out this video right here. If you want to be chopping through your foes all the time, I highly recommend watching this video. And thank you for entering the dungeon.